Hey guys, Hamish here coming at you with another video, which is surprisingly not an update video. Who would have thunk it? So as you guys know, we just finished the first book in the Percy Jackson series, The Lightning Thief. Oh, my copy's a little bit frayed. Guess I should take better care of it. It was an amazing story filled with engaging characters and hilarious dialogue, and what I'm here to talk about with you today, interesting themes. I even got dressed up for the occasion. Now, before you tell me that dissecting a book in some way ruins the enjoyment of the book or is looking too far into things, I'd invite you to look at the fact that we dissect books all the time outside of an educational setting, and it almost always increases our enjoyment of the book. Take Tumblr, for example. Amidst all the weird GIFs and social activist posts, there are plenty of people posting their favorite lines from books. Whether it be Snape's always from Harry Potter or this line from The Great Gatsby. And so we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. Or some other quote from your favorite book. Regardless, they always have this little bit of text underneath that says what they've learned about the book or something that they've seen in another character. Well, that's basically what you're doing in school, albeit in essay form. We're looking at what connects with us in a book. So just because something's educational doesn't mean it isn't necessarily fun or interesting. So what kind of themes exist in Percy Jackson? Well, there are a lot of them, but we're going to be focusing on two main ones today. They're probably the biggest in the entire book. The first is that of identity, and the second is that of challenging the status quo. Whoa there, High School Musical! Your family-friendly shenanigans are going to get me a copyright claim. Again. While you guys simmer down, how about we start off with the first and biggest theme of this book, identity. Identity is one of the biggest themes in this book, solely because it's what almost all the major characters are searching for. On literally the first page of the book, Percy Jackson introduces himself to us with a question. Am I a troubled kid? Yeah, you could say that. While it's partially meant to showcase Percy's humor, it also holds a lot of weight in saying Percy doesn't really know who he is. He struggles a lot in schools and he gets into trouble with teachers, but he doesn't understand why. He can point to events in his life that have led to him getting into trouble and being told that he's a bad kid, but in the first chapter, we're also shown examples of how he's a really good kid. He's respectful of his teacher, Mr. Brunner, he stands up for Grover when he's being bullied, and he honestly tries to get involved with the educational field trip, albeit with some reluctance. But come on, can any of you honestly say that you didn't go to some field trip with a little bit of doubt about how fun it was going to be? I liked going to the museum. Hush, young Hamish. They must never know. Another factor that contributes to Percy's uncertainty is the fact that his father is absent from his life and that he's never met him. All he has to know the man is the story that his mother tells him of the summer she spent with him, as well as this memory of a warm glow. Now, if his father were dead or a deadbeat, he might be able to identify himself solely through his mother. But because there is a mystery surrounding his father's disappearance, Percy is more unsure of himself, and therefore doesn't really know where he comes from. Things turn around when Percy discovers the mythical world. All of a sudden, everything around him changes, and things surprisingly start to make more sense. He learns that he's a half-blood, a descendant of one of three immensely powerful beings, and that his learning disabilities, his ADHD and his dyslexia, are actually markers of heroic skills and powers, and that there are kids out there exactly like him. All these factors allow Percy not only to identify himself through others, but in the world around him, and it culminates in two very important scenes. The first is the battle with Echidna, where she taunts Percy with his identity by saying, "If you were truly the son of Poseidon, you would not fear water," on page 210. At first, Percy buys into this doubt, almost convincing himself not to jump. But instead, he chooses to believe in his bloodline, and by extension himself, to jump out of the arch and save his life. The second and perhaps more meaningful example occurs at the end of the book. Percy is faced with a choice: stay within the relatively safe walls of Camp Half-Blood, or go back to the mortal world filled with monsters where he could potentially get hurt. He chooses the latter by remembering the words of his father. "The sea does not like to be restrained," on page 375. Percy realizes that, like the sea, he's a free being, and that he has to make his own path. By choosing the more dangerous option, he's essentially taking control of his life. While I focus mainly on Percy, the other characters also suffer from a lack of identity. Annabeth, who spent most of her life in Camp Half-Blood, desperately wants a quest because the real world is where the monsters are. That's where you learn whether you're any good or not. On page 170. Having been rejected by her family for being a problem, Annabeth wants to prove that she is someone worthwhile. By the end of the novel, she learns to let go of those feelings that she isn't good enough, as evidenced when she tries to reconnect with her dad. She learned through her quest with Percy and Grover that she doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. She's good just being who she is. At the same time, Grover has big dreams of becoming a searcher, but feels he isn't good enough to live up to the task. His perceived failures through Thalia and Percy, two very powerful half-bloods, lead him to believe that he is the worst satyr in the world, on page 59, despite the fact that there were other, more powerful forces constantly intervening. Again, at the end of the novel, Grover has gained a searcher's license, and has learned to believe in his own strengths that he discovered on the quest with his friends. Even Luke and Percy's mother fall into this theme. Luke, who feels abandoned by his father and bitter about the life of a demigod, tries to find his identity through servitude to Kronos, whom he believes will give his life meaning. Percy's mother takes control of her life from her abusive husband Gabe when she realizes she doesn't need to protect her son anymore. This moment for me, personally, is very powerful because of Percy's mother's speech. I think you know, Percy. I think you're enough like me to understand. If my life is going to mean anything, I have to live it myself. I can't let a god take care of me. Or my son. I have to find the courage on my own. So now that we've gotten through themes of identity, it's time to move on to challenging the status quo. What did I say, High School Musical? Although, your song is oddly relevant to what we're going to be talking about.
I hope you realize that middle schoolers won't get these jokes.
It's a movie that defined a generation. Go back to playing your Pokemon games, young Hamish.
Way ahead of you.
Anyway, the second theme that we're not going to spend as much time on is the idea that traditions in the mythical world aren't as relevant in the modern age as they were 2,000 years ago. Shocker, I know. Percy is constantly questioning the superiority of the gods, even insulting them, something which Annabeth and Grover find very appalling. Riordan marks a very sharp divide between those who have lived in the system for a long time versus those who come into it later on. Annabeth and Grover, who've lived most of their lives with knowledge of gods and monsters, accept the Greek gods' rule as the way the world works. Percy, on the other hand, who lived a rather unfair life, resists the inherent superiority of the gods. He says it on page 114, and throughout the entirety of the book, that isn't fair. Because he's right. It's not. Because the gods can't act directly, they manipulate heroes into doing quests, which oftentimes leaves the hero's life worse off than before. Luke is a prime example of this. Luke, who feels the gods' way of doing things causes more harm than good, rebels against their authority. He says it quite plainly on page 365. Their precious Western civilization is a disease, Percy. It's killing the world. The only way to stop it is to burn it to the ground, to start over with something more honest. It's understandable that Luke feels this way, because Percy has had these feelings as well. But here's where we see a stark difference in their characters. Luke chooses to use these feelings to create change through destruction, whereas Percy chooses to use them to create change through example. The physical embodiment of Percy's struggle with the gods is represented through his battle with Ares. Here, the odds are totally stacked against Percy. He's up against an immortal being who can manipulate reality at a whim and has way more experience than him. But despite the odds, Percy pushes back against him and even manages to land a critical blow. He doesn't choose to kill Ares, he chooses to wound him, so he runs off like a dog, as an example that change is coming. While there are many themes in the Percy Jackson series, those two stood out to me as the most relevant in this book. They create a strong narrative, and they connect to us in very real ways, albeit through the lens of a fantasy novel. I hope you guys have enjoyed exploring this book as much as I have over the course of this year, and I hope to see you again in the next year. Have a happy holidays, guys, and see you next time. Bye.